Ralph and Hugh, always looking for new adventures, found a dark envelope under Ralph's door one rainy night. The handwriting was elegant and the seal an enigmatic symbol. Inside, an invitation to a party in an abandoned building promised an unforgettable night. Intrigued, the two friends decided to investigate. They followed directions to an old building whose broken windows and worn walls whispered stories of better days. When they entered, the atmosphere transformed. Soft lights illuminated the space, while hypnotic music filled the air, vibrating off the peeling walls and cracked floors. As they advanced, they noticed that everyone present was wearing white, expressionless masks that completely hid their identities. These strangers moved with a disturbing grace, as if each step was choreographed. Ralph felt a rush of excitement mixed with a touch of fear as Hugh looked around, trying to take in his surroundings. Masks were not just an accessory, they seemed to symbolize something deeper, a ritual or a secret shared only among those initiated. Ralph and Hugh felt like intruders at an unfamiliar ceremony, watching the guests move in sync, almost as if they were in a trance. The music, a repetitive and captivating melody, seemed to control their movements, guiding them in a macabre dance that knew no end. They wondered who these people were behind the masks and what the true purpose of that night was. As the night progressed, the feeling of disorientation increased. With each new room they explored, the place seemed to unfold more mysteries. In one corner, a small crowd had gathered, whispering secrets in a barely audible whisper. In another, couples danced slowly, their movements so perfectly aligned that they appeared as one. Ralph tried to connect with anyone present, but their blank stares beneath their white masks were impenetrable, increasing the two friends' sense of isolation. As they explored the environment, a disturbing reality began to emerge. There were no visible exits. Every door they passed seemed to only lead to more hallways and rooms. The music never stopped, filling the space with its oppressive presence. Ralph and Hugh began to question the nature of the party, feeling more and more like pieces in a game whose rules they didn't know. It was then that the lights flickered, plunging the building into temporary darkness, a prelude to the true terror that was about to begin. The lights flickered unexpectedly, plunging the room into thick darkness. When they returned, Hugh was no longer there. In its place, just an empty chair and an old television humming subtly before turning on. The screen showed Hugh tied up and visibly terrified in a room Ralph didn't recognize. A distorted and metallic voice echoed through the space, cold and calculating, "Play, or you will never see him again." Ralph felt a chill run down his spine. Fear and confusion mixed together as he tried to process the surreal situation in front of him. Ralph looked around, searching for any sign of Hugh or an explanation for what had just happened. The party seemed to have transformed. The other guests continued to dance slowly, their expressions unchanged by the white masks, as if nothing had happened. The metallic voice reverberated in his mind, urgent and threatening. With his heart pounding, Ralph knew he had to act. But what? The proposed game was nebulous, with no clear rules or indication of how to start. He approached the television, trying to find some clue he could use to save his friend. As Ralph tried to think under the pressure of the countdown that now appeared on the screen, he noticed that every eye in the room was turning to him. The whispers among the masked men grew louder, an ominous sound that seemed to carry a warning, "Play or disappear." Ralph felt isolated, a pawn on a macabre chessboard whose pieces were manipulated by invisible hands. He had to decide quickly. Resolutely, he took a step forward, accepting the challenge posed by the distorted voice. "I'll play," he said aloud, his decision echoing through the room, silencing the murmurs. The television changed scenes suddenly, showing quick images of Hugh struggling against his bonds, increasingly desperate. "Good choice," scoffed the metallic voice as the countdown paused at an arbitrary number. "Your every move will have direct consequences for your friend. Choose wisely." The room transformed once more, revealing a game board on the floor, each square seeming to signify a fatal choice. Ralph swallowed hard, his mind racing to formulate a plan that could lead them both to salvation, or at least a way out of this horrible situation. Ralph now found himself at the center of a psychological arena, every step and decision weighed under the watchful eyes of masked spectators. The atmosphere was charged, the air thick with anticipation of what would come next. "To begin with," the voice continued, "you must choose between the pawn and the knight. One moves in a straight line, the other at an angle. Choose wrong and the consequences will be painful." Showing Hugh's image on the screen again, now breathing heavily and eyes wide in terror, Ralph knew that each choice was not just about moves in a game, but about his friend's life and suffering. With a heaviness in his chest and cold determination, he reached out to make his first move, aware that every move was a gamble in the darkness. The lights came on abruptly, cutting through the darkness that had momentarily engulfed the room. In the center of attention, a countdown emerged on the old television screen with rapidly decreasing red numbers. Ralph felt the weight of all the eyes fixed on him, penetrating and implacable. The masked guests, previously scattered, now formed a circle around him, muttering in a low, menacing chorus, "Play or disappear." There was no escape. The only option was to move forward, into the unknown that awaited him beyond the hall. Doors. Pushed by the ominous chorus, Ralph walked slowly toward the dark hall, where the light barely touched the surfaces. There, a gigantic chessboard was laid out on the floor, each piece exaggeratedly large, as if destined to be manipulated by giants. The air was colder here, and the atmosphere carried a palpable tension. At the back of the room, the television continued to broadcast the countdown, now accompanied by a soundtrack that amplified the suspense. Ralph was now in the heart of the in-game, a game he barely understood, but whose rules he knew he must follow. The game was clearly not ordinary. The pieces, although recognizable as chess pieces, seemed to have a darker meaning. Ralph approached, touching one of the nearest pieces, a pawn. Upon his touch, the piece emanated a low sound, almost a hum, which reverberated throughout the space. A new voice, this time clearer, sounded across the room. "Every move here reflects your friend's fate. Choose wisely, for each move is final." Ralph took a deep breath, his heart racing with adrenaline and the fear of what a mistake could cost. Looking at the board, Ralph was trying to anticipate the consequences of each possible move. With each passing second, the pressure increased, as did the countdown on the screen, which now marked critical minutes. He knew that each piece moved could mean relief or disaster for Hugh. Carefully, he moved the pawn, a simple but tense move. Immediately, the screen flashed a quick image of Hugh, still alive but clearly distressed. Ralph realized that every move was a gamble on his friend's well-being. As the game progressed, Ralph became more aware of the gravity of his situation. The masked men watched silently, their expressions hidden, but their intentions clearly malevolent. Ralph's every move was followed by an immediate on-screen reaction, which showed Hugh reacting, either with momentary relief or obvious pain. It was as if Ralph was bound to Hugh by more than friendship, now bound by a cruel game of life and death. Determined to save them both, Ralph planned his next moves with a mix of strategy and desperate hope, knowing that each choice could be his last. On the dark chessboard, Ralph faced a challenge that transcended the ordinary game. Each piece seemed to have a visceral connection to Hugh, tying his well-being to each movement he made. The weight of this reality hit him fully when, after a hesitant move by a bishop, the screen showed Hugh screaming in agony as a dark shadow seemed to wrap around his arm, causing him to disappear into thin air. Ralph, paralyzed with horror, realized that the game not only mirrored a battle of wits, but also determined his friend's physical fate, with each piece moved, sealing part of Hugh's fate. With a heavy heart and shaking hands, Ralph faced the board with new determination. He knew that every choice could result in irreversible pain for Hugh. The silence of the masked spectators was deafening, the pressure of their invisible expectations heavy in the air. Ralph advanced his horse, trying to predict the consequences of his strategy when the television showed Hugh momentarily relieving his breathing. It was a small comfort to Ralph, a brief indication that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to play this macabre game and still protect his friend. With each subsequent movement, the tension in the hall intensified. Ralph felt every second and every breath as if it were his last. His focus was total, trying to anticipate the pitfalls and consequences hidden in the game's design. The television served as a tortured mirror of Hugh's suffering, each new scene a stab at Ralph's heart. The pain and fear reflected in Hugh's eyes were a constant reminder of the cruel game they had been forced to play. Ralph moved the queen, a risky move, and held his breath as he waited for the reaction on the screen. Unfortunately, the move did not have the desired effect. The screen flashed violently before, showing Hugh writhing in pain as one of his legs disappeared into the darkness, consumed by the game. Ralph felt a wave of despair and guilt wash over him. Every wrong decision translated into a physical loss for Hugh, and he was in charge of those decisions. The reality that he could be directly causing his friend's suffering was a mental torture that Ralph struggled to bear. The pressure to think logically under such extreme circumstances was overwhelming, each moment stretching out like an eternity. Despite the terror and anguish the game caused, Ralph knew he couldn't give up. He had to keep going, trying to find some logic or pattern that would minimize the damage to Hugh. The moves became more calculated, with Ralph weighing the possible consequences of each action with extreme care. With each movement, he tried to connect with Hugh through the screen, searching for some sign or message that could guide him. Ralph's fight was not just against the board, but against his own fear and the pain of seeing a friend suffer. Determined, he planned his next move, each move a combination of hope and fear, every second counting in the battle to save Hugh's life. After a succession of torturous moves, Ralph was faced with a devastating revelation. The screen displaying Hugh abruptly changed to a series of recorded clips, showing Hugh at different times, clearly before the party. The metallic voice sounded again, cold and imperturbable. The game was over before it even began. Ralph, Hugh was dead from the start. Ralph felt the ground open beneath his feet, the reality of manipulation and deceit hitting him like a physical blow. The images on the screen showed Hugh living his life, completely oblivious to the fate that awaited him. The voice continued, "You were just a pawn on our board, Ralph, as he once was." Ralph realized with horror that his memories of past events were beginning to realign, revealing that he himself had participated in this macabre party before, not as a spectator but as a player, and that he had forgotten everything until that crucial moment. The room went dark momentarily before lights focused on Ralph, now completely alone. The reality of their situation was beginning to set in. He had been manipulated to return, to play again, in an eternal repetition of the cruel cycle. "The next party is already scheduled, Ralph. It's time to choose the next player," the voice announced, as a new stack of invitations appeared in front of her. The choice was an illusion. Ralph was trapped in a vicious cycle from which there was no visible escape. With shaking hands, Ralph took one of the invitations, each marked with a different name. He knew now that each name was potentially another victim, another friend who could go through the same horror. But refusing to choose meant defying the game's organizers, something he knew was dangerous. With the voice of conscience screaming in protest, he selected a name, aware that he was perpetuating the cycle of terror. As he did so, he felt a part of himself resigning himself to the fate he himself had been forced to accept. As the party faded into the background and the light of reality began to dim, Ralph found himself in a new room, similar to the one in which Hugh was last shown. A new white mask rested on a nearby table next to a mirror that reflected his pale, haggard face. The choice was made, and the mask was now his new identity. The metallic voice sounded one. Last time, welcome to the game, Ralph. Now it's your turn to be the host. With that, the screen went dark, and the sound of a crowd whispering grew until it became a deafening scream, announcing the start of another macabre party.